Thank you very much. Got it. So that's the 5 points. Okay, so let's do an icebreaker. So there was a film in 1951 called When Worlds Collide, which is before my time, but it is a spaceship full of all the creme de la creme, chosen ones, who have to fly off to a inhabitable planet far, far away because Earth is at danger of collision with a moon or something like that. So we are all the chosen ones. We're all moving to a new planet, whatever it may be called. You can take just one thing. Now, that one thing can be anything. Okay? So, what would it be and why? So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing for now so I can see everybody. I'll start us off. And then what you do is say that, and then you pick the next person to go, okay? So I would take a wine lake because A, you can swim in it for exercise, B, you can drink it for sustenance, and it's possibly one of your 5 a day. So that's what I would take. So I will hand over to, who should I hand over to? Karam.
Hello. Right. I don't know. Can I take the internet? I guess I can't really take the internet as a whole. Kind of reminds me of that IP Crowd episode. I think if I had to take one thing, if I can't take the internet, it would probably be, I don't know, a bottle of water because I need water to survive.
You can take the internet. You can take the internet, bro.
The internet,
you take whatever you like.
Good. There we go then.
So you would take a bottle of water, but unfortunately, I'm sorry, Karam, you cannot take that bottle of water. Choose somebody to go next.
Malcolm.
Oh, saw that coming. I'll take my dog because she's like a little bit of a therapy dog. As you can see her there.
Oh, that,
keep everybody happy. Good spirits up.
So unfortunately, Malcolm, you cannot take your therapy dog.
Oh, I'll happily glide into the moon then. No problem.
There you go. Pick the next person. Who do you want to go next?
Sorry, my bad. Let's go with Claire, shall we?
Hiya. So in terms of what I would take, I was also going to take my dog, but you've we've already confirmed that that's definitely not allowed. How about back gardens? Can you take your own back garden? Is that allowed? It's my safe space, my quiet space.
Is that what you want to take?
Yeah, absolutely. It's my little bit of tranquility.
I'm sorry, you cannot take your back garden. Sorry. Pick somebody to go next.
How about Malcolm?
I just went. I can go against that.
Oh, sorry. Joe, then.
Hi, everyone. I would take Berghain, which is a techno club in Berlin.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. But unfortunately, you cannot take that techno club from Berlin. I'll explain why you can't take these things later. Pick somebody to go next.
I pick Hugh.
Thank you, Joe. Given though we're going to be surviving, I'm going to take my survival knife, please.
You know what, Hugh? You can indeed take your survival knife.
Thank you.
Would you choose somebody to go next, please?
Yes, certainly. I'm going to pick Martin.
Yeah, I'm trying to work out what was actually behind the 51. There's one thing I'm not doing without, it's moving on mattress.
Sorry, Martin, what you say? I find it difficult to hear.
Sorry, I've got a really rubbish. So I think if there's one thing I'm not doing without, that's my mattress. If I'm going all that way, I'm going to be sleeping well.
Oh, well, unfortunately, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to take your mattress. Could you pick who's going next?
We missed Michael.
Thanks, Martin. All right, I guess I would take my Kindle because, you know, all the books in the world probably a pretty good hack for surviving outer space, right?
And you know what, Michael? You can take your Kindle.
Ooh.
There you go. Choose somebody to go next.
Who hasn't gone next?
I think Damela's been, or
yeah, Damela. Go on, I'll pick Damela. Go on.
Cool. Well, okay. I was going to say, first thing I thought of was taking my laptop, but because that seems to be something can't seem to do without, but I won't choose that. Doesn't seem very practical. How about a box of matches? Can I take that?
Box of matches? No. Sorry.
No. All
No
right.
box of matches, no. Choose who goes next. I think we've got either Chris or Daniel.
I choose Daniel.
Me probably would take the internet because I can't do without it. I'm always online doing something. I don't know if I can take that.
No, you can't take that either. Chris, you joined us late. We're all going to a new planet, and you can take one thing. So, what is it and why? So, I think Daniel, you're going to choose Chris next.
So yeah, it has to be Chris.
Yep. Cheers. Thanks. Could I bring a wine bottle?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great.
Bring a wine bottle. Okay, brilliant.
Well done, Chris.
Has everybody had a go now? Yeah, okay. So it's the power of saying thank you. So those that said thank you to the person that handed over to them get what they want. It's cheesy, but people don't get it. If you've done it before, yeah. I'm guessing Hugh maybe did it before.
Christina ran our retro about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, there you go. So it's just the awesome power of saying the simple thing like thank you could open so many doors for you. Right. Okay. That said, I'm going to go back to my screen sharing. There we go. So just move that. So I can say welcome to the second of these meetups. This month's theme is learning from mistakes to do things differently and improve the software development lifecycle. So we've got two guest speakers. We've got Karam and we've got Hugh, both going to entertain us with their talks. And at the end of that, we'll have a break in the middle. And at the end of that, we'll follow that with a bit of feedback and some details of our next meetup. So without further ado, there's a little bit about what Karam's going to speak about. I will stop sharing and I will hand over to Karam, who should have the power.
I should. Thank you. See, I remembered that time. Right.
You're welcome.
Cool. So hopefully, can everyone see my screen and just the presentation part of the screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. Right. So when I first saw sort of the synopsis, I think that's the right word for what today was going to be on about. Like, I gave this talk back in 2019 when I made this mistake. And when I saw that the synopsis was essentially talking about mistakes, I thought that this is a really, really good opportunity to give this talk again. So as you can probably tell from the title, I somehow ended up with a $750 AWS bill. And the thing is, usually as a company, $750 doesn't seem like a lot. But when you're an individual who's somehow accumulated that over 24 hours, you're probably doing something wrong. And so I'm here today to tell everyone about the mistake that I made and how everyone else can prevent making the same mistake. So out of interest, who here on the call uses AWS? Any hands? Some thumbs up? Cool, awesome. So for anyone who doesn't know what AWS is, AWS stands for Amazon Web Services. And to cut a long story short, back in the day, companies used to have massive air-conditioned rooms with big, expensive computers in them connected to the internet. And that used to be sort of where they would host software and things. Now there's a thing called the cloud, where someone like an Amazon takes care of all of that overhead for us. And they provide services such as EC2 that allows us or companies to rent big and powerful computers to host and run things on that are connected to the internet. Now, following on from the previous question, out of interest, who has spent over £20 a month on their personal AWS account before? No one? Just me? Okay, fair enough. So on that note, this is a story all about how I ended up with a $750 AWS bill overnight. Now, when I ended up with the bill in 2019, the $750 was not quite the same exchange rate, shall we say, but we'll leave that joke for later. Yeah, that's what the AWS logo ended up looking like to me once I ended up with the bill. And the truth is that I made a mistake. Now, third and final of the major questions. Does anyone here watch Law and Order? No one? Any hands? No. Okay, so Law and Order has this thing, right? Because it's like, there's loads of different Law and Orders, and it's all like about crime and stuff. So as they split the episode into chapters, they sort of go to a black screen like this, and it goes dun dun. So when I used to give this in person, I used to have the dun dun noise. It used to make people laugh. So every time you see one of these screens, just imagine a dun dun noise in your head. But basically, long story short, it was Monday, the 8th of July, 2019, approximately 1 p.m. I was in my previous employer's office, minding my own business, and I had an Android phone. And it had the Microsoft Outlook app on it. And I used Microsoft Outlook on my phone for basically all my emails, personal and work. The problem, though, is that back in 2019, it had a bug. So basically, if you were locked out of one of your emails, you couldn't then access any of the other emails until you sorted out that email that you were locked out on. So I had 4 different emails on it, and I was locked out of Outlook because it was that time of the month again where your work email is like, reset the password, reset the password. So it was really annoying, and I couldn't access any of my other emails until I reset the password. And me being lazy, I just couldn't be bothered resetting the password for whatever reason at the time. Now, earlier in the week as well, and this is where this whole background story gets really confusing, I'd also changed the password for my personal secondary email address. And I couldn't remember what I changed that password to because I used a password manager that wasn't on my phone at the time. So because that was blocking me changing my work password using Outlook, I basically had to log into my work email on Outlook and log into the secondary email address. And because I couldn't remember that password, I just deleted that email off my phone because it was annoying. And then when I got back to the office after lunchtime, I then actually changed my password for work. And then it signed me in on my phone. But I only had 3 emails left on my phone, not 4. And you'll see as this goes on where this all sort of links in after I deleted this secondary personal email. So the secondary personal email was also my AWS account alert email address. So in AWS, you can sort of set up alerts. It's up to you what those alerts are on. It could be, for example, is something you're hosting given an error rate of over 5%. You can get an email alert, you can get a text message, you can get God knows what else under the sun. And for me, I had budget alerts because they tend to be quite popular for obvious reasons. And so me obviously deleting that email address off my phone, you can probably see where this is going. So dun dun, the murder mystery continues. So a couple of days later, I'm in my bedroom, minding my own business at night. And, you know, being a software developer, as you do, you tend to write code, as sad as it is. You spend the entire day writing code, then you go home and write more code. Probably sums up my life, but yeah. So yeah, as developers, we use this thing called GitHub, and it basically allows us to collaborate with other developers, push code up, pull code down, see changes and so on. In this case, I was working on a personal project. It was using AWS Cognito and Lambda at the time. Unfortunately, pushing up my changes, the GitHub logo, similar to the AWS logo, after I pushed up my changes, went from this smiley face to this sad face. So as the murder mystery continues, roughly about an hour later, I realized that I'd set something up incorrectly because it was the evening and I wasn't paying attention, and I basically committed what are my AWS secret access keys to GitHub. Now, this was a public repository as well. So bearing that in mind, my AWS access keys are essentially 2 private keys that anyone with an AWS account gets that allows them access to certain resources in AWS. And one thing we're going to look at as we go towards the end is something called I am in AWS that allows you to define these accounts and then essentially break down roles and responsibilities to ensure that certain accounts only have limited access to certain things. In my case, these were the access keys to my root account. So it essentially meant anyone with these keys could do whatever they wanted with my AWS account that obviously had my bank account details linked to it. So I saw this and thought to myself, something's not quite right here. How did I end up with this mess? And I realized it was a public repository at the time, but I thought to myself, you know what, calm down. I got this. So I logged into AWS. I went to the little security credentials bit and I just deactivated those keys. It was probably 5 minutes. Like I thought to myself, you know, no one's going to have enough time to go onto my personal GitHub unless they're spying on me, notice that I made that mistake and then nick the keys. If I just deactivate those keys or rotate them, I should be all right because, you know, 5 minutes isn't long enough to do anything. Meanwhile, though, I was getting emails like this to the email that I deleted off my phone. So I wasn't getting the notification. So whilst all this was happening and I was really chilled out, I was getting emails with the title, your AWS keys are exposed on GitHub. Your account has been verified in Sydney, Tokyo, account closure, please read. And all this was being sent to that email I'd removed off my phone and I had no idea because I was in bed. So 19 hours later, I was at work again, dun. I was in the car park at 4:30. It was a Friday. You know, I look like Freddie Flintstone here. Looking forward to the weekend. Jumped in my car, got home, yabba dabba do, and then out of the blue, it all came crashing down. So I was in my parents' kitchen, and in AWS, you can set up a secondary email. And my secondary email was my main personal email that fortunately I still had on my phone. And that's what I'd seen when I'd looked at my phone. An email titled, monthly AWS budget has exceeded your alert threshold. And that was sort of when the penny dropped. And this is how I felt. And this is what I did. So out of the blue, my parents and brother see me running out of the kitchen thinking, what on earth has happened to this guy? And I ran up the stairs like Homer Simpson, went to my bedroom, logged onto AWS, and quite literally saw this. This is a genuine screenshot from my EC2 page. So as we can see here, C3 larges, C4 larges, really expensive computers in the Southeast availability zone. So, you know, nowhere even in Europe, were spun up on my account, costing me quite a lot of money. And this naturally was my reaction when so not only had they spun up accounts all over Europe, but they also spun up, EC2 instances. They also spun up EC2 instances all over North America and all over Asia. And this was my reaction. So suddenly my entire AWS account was going wild all over the world. And in just 24 hours, my account accumulated a bill of just over $750. And the funny part is all this was in the name of Bitcoin. So to cut a long story short, people know that people are stupid and make mistakes. At the end, I shouldn't say stupid, we're all human, we all make mistakes. And I guess I think I'm a human being and I definitely made a mistake at the time. So people have bots that are constantly scraping any new public commit to GitHub. And they're able to intelligently identify whenever someone puts these AWS keys up. And essentially seconds are all these bots need to nick your keys. Excuse me, just need to cough. Excuse me, to nick your keys and then run some automated scripts to create all these AWS resources, probably without you realizing, and costing you all this money. Now, the interesting part, though, was that my $750 was quite minimal in comparison to some of the other stories out there where people have fallen for this same error. So there was a company where they'd spent over, just under $100,000 in 4.5 days. I believe this company were doing something like interviews and having people use AWS on a certain account. And for some reason, were fine with candidates committing to public Git repositories. They went away over a bank holiday weekend or something like that and came back to this bill of $91,000. Another individual, similar scenario to myself, ended up with a bill of $14,000. Again, similar scenario, made a mistake, pushed his keys up. Guess it just took him a bit longer to realize. So why am I telling you all this? You probably realized by now based on the synopsis of why we're here today. But the train guy, Richard Branson, says you learn by doing and falling over. And regardless of what you think of his trains and whatnot, he's probably a relatively smart guy. So it is what it is. Smart people do stupid things. Stupid people don't learn from them. Frank Sonnenberg, an author. And my favorite, with the mistakes you make, you learn a lot. With the mistakes that others make, you also learn a lot. And that was by none other than Jose Mourinho, the special one himself. So if all these people are saying this, then, you know, fair play as to why we're here today. We're here to admit we've made mistakes, and we're here to learn from our own mistakes, teach others from our own mistakes, and learn from others' mistakes. Lessons learned. I certainly learned a lot going through this experience. So I'm here today to put you all through the same experience so that you don't have to actually hands-on deal with it the same way I did, but to learn the same way I did. So first thing to avoid this happening, enable MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. Essentially on your AWS account, on your root account, what it allows you to essentially do, and you can enable it on other accounts as well, which you should enable it on all accounts, cut a long story short. But initially when you log in, you'll have a root account. Multi-factor authentication essentially means if someone has your username and password or email and password, they can't log in without access to your phone, for example. Those keys that we saw earlier, you can also use something like AWS Rotate Key that will ensure you rotate them every 90 days. That's in case where they get leaked, similar to what happens with passwords, obviously, when password leaks happen. Someone might not get access to your keys instantly like what happened with me, but if you're rotating them relatively regularly, hopefully by the time they fall into the wrong hands, it won't be the end of the world. Follow IAM best practices. Anyone that uses AWS, please, they have a really good white paper on this. Just give it a read, follow IAM best practices. If you do the AWS practitioner certification, a lot of the things you have to learn to pass that exam talk about IAM best practices. So for example, you get questions about whether or not you should set up access keys for your root user. That was the mistake I did, because your root user essentially is like an all-powerful admin user, has access to everything. Once they got those keys, they could spin up absolutely everything they wanted. If I'd, for example, had a specific account for that application that was limited to AWS Lambda and Cognito, those two services, they only would have been able to essentially spin Lambdas up, which are serverless and won't cost a penny up to a certain extent. They wouldn't have been able to create these massive, expensive EC2 computers to mine Bitcoin on. And they call it the privilege of least privilege, where you ensure that each account only has the minimum access it requires. You can also use things like temporary credentials whenever you need to use access and secret keys. Again, they'll have a lifetime of about, you can dictate it really as small as I think 5 minutes to 24 hours. Quite obvious why temporary credentials will be useful for this sort of thing. You can consider paying for guard duty. Now, it does cost money, obviously, but it's basically a threat detection service that AWS offer. Now, if you're a big company, it's probably worth every penny. If you're an individual, it's up to you to decide whether it's a good idea or not, but it basically uses artificial intelligence. It uses something called CloudTrail to learn how you usually access your AWS account and use it. And then if there's something strange, like, for example, you're suddenly spinning up all these EC2 instances when all you've ever done before is next to nothing, it will do something about it versus what happened with me, where they sort of let the costs accumulate. There's something called the AWS Labs Git secrets tool as well. It's a Git hook. That basically means whenever you push up any code to any repository, it will run. And what it does is it's smart enough to look out for these AWS access and secret keys. So if I were to make the same mistake again, it would stop my code essentially going into the internet and being exposed. There's also something called Local Stack. Now, it does have a free tier and it has a paid tier as well. but I think the free tier suffices for the example use case we've seen here today. What it does is it creates your own local version of AWS on your machine, so you don't actually ever, when developing locally, have to interact with the actual cloud. This is really useful if you work professionally, because chances are once you get out of a feature branch on your machine and you deploy to some sort of testing environment, that will hook into a real AWS world. And so you can sort of get the best of both worlds. So basically the idea is that since local stack runs on your machine, your credentials will never go over the wire to anywhere, which basically constricts the possibility of this same mistake occurring. Now, if anyone did find this helpful, you can help me pay the bill off. Just scan that QR code there. Don't actually scan the QR code, otherwise you'll get rickrolled. But no, they didn't make me pay a penny. In conclusion, learn from my mistakes and do things differently. I've gone through this pain. Other people have gone through this pain. Don't make the same mistake. I know it's easy, especially in my case, what led to this, where you're tired after work, you just want to work on something. You can't be bothered doing things by the book as you would do in your normal job because it seems like the stakes are low. But with something like AWS, where you can't set a limit on your account, the stakes are never low. And even though they obviously wrote it off, and they've written way more off for companies and people before, I'm sure they have a limit where, they can only keep letting you off so many times. So don't ignore IAM best practices and take this stuff seriously. Like some of the stuff I've suggested before, like the Git hook, for example, it takes a few minutes to install them, and it could basically save a lot of money as well as headaches. Don't rely purely on billing alerts, because mine arrived 19 hours too late to my secondary email. Now, obviously, if I'd had my main email on my phone, I would have got them instantly. But in this case, I didn't. And not everyone has their emails notifying them 24/7 on their phone. And as we said earlier, AWS, even though they sent me an email saying something weird's going on, they don't stop the instances accumulating costs. Because if you actually mean to do it, that is then problematic, especially if you're a large company dealing with something like a Black Friday or something. They won't voluntarily stop weird behavior like that, unless I think you configure something like guard duty manually to do something like that. So yeah, AWS support were great. I didn't have to pay a penny. That's my story about my $750 AWS, $750 AWS bill. If you've got any questions, fire away. If not, as we said at the start, thank you is really important, and thanking others. So thank you for listening to me today. And don't make this same mistake, please.
That was brilliant. Thanks, Karam. Malcolm's got a question.
Go for it.
No, I don't have a question. I was just clapping. Good stuff.
Oh, thank you. Cheers.
David.
Same. Just a clap.
Oh, sorry.
Michael's got his hand up though.
There you go.
Michael's got his hand up. I must learn the difference between clapping and putting your hand up. There you go.
Sorry, yeah, I'll start with the question. So how quickly did you get from the period of just pure embarrassment where you didn't want to tell anyone what happened to actually learning from this and sharing the story with people? What was the time period to go through that journey?
Oh, that's, to be fair, well, sorry, I've had the flu over the past couple of days. I think once I solved it, I kind of realized, talking to colleagues at work as well, because a lot of people's reaction was sort of like, oh my God, how did you manage that? And it seemed like people were keen to learn. And it felt like people were keen to learn because they didn't want it to happen to themselves as well. So that's when I sort of realized, hold on a second, I can actually turn this negative into a positive and turn this into a talk. So I'd say it was quite soon, but I can get the exact date between when it happened and the first time I presented on this and figure that out. It'll be interesting.
Well, I've got a question for you, Karam.
Go for it.
AWS must be costing them an absolute fortune, because there's not only you going to have made that mistake. Are they doing anything about it to plug that kind of loophole, or is it just something that is always going to be there and you've got to follow those workarounds and best practice that you suggested?
Oof. To be honest, I think the thing with Amazon is they make so much money that even though 20 grand seems really significant to us, a 20 grand loss for them, don't think is significant enough. That's why they make that decision that rather than stop us spending money with them, they would rather just reimburse the costs of a mistake than stop the EC2 instances, for example, because it's probably peanuts to them. But it's frustrating, and I know it's a reason, I've heard it before, where people slightly prefer Azure, because I think Azure lets you set billing limits on accounts. It's a bit more user-friendly that way, and other cloud services do that as well, but Amazon are just a different beast.
Well, okay. Any more questions for Karam? No? Okay, so let's have a 5-minute break. So let's come back at 1:45, slightly more than 5 minutes. Let's come back at 1:45 and have our next guest speaker talking about producty things. Okay? Give us a thumbs up if you're back. That's a good idea.
You never know. There's probably going to be a lot more snoring, after the first few slides.
Well, you have been known to go on longer than the DFS sale. So I'm glad you've cut it a bit shorter tonight for us, Hugh.
Well, I only deleted 97 slides.
Wow, we are honoured. Brilliant. Okay, so without further ado, let me hand over to Hugh, who's going to talk about improving the software development life cycle. My words out. Let me stop sharing in order to allow you to show your own slides, Hugh.
So if I share screen 3, hopefully, if that comes up.
Perfect.
Wow, look at that technology working. That's a good start to the evening, isn't it? So, hello, I'm Hugh Wood. I'm the practice lead for technology in Club Kilburn, Manchester. So I work with Mike, Karam, and Christina when she's around. This is about the SDLC. How do you monitor it? How do you improve it? And if you look at the original ISO documentation on this, it's really boring, it's really dry, you get lost very easily. So what I've done and what I do is I've boiled this down into a way that's easy to follow and easy to implement. It allows you to not be too restrictive as well when making these improvements to the SDLC. What is SDLC? So that's the first thing. It's the life cycle on what we do for a living, right? So it's where we discover, design, develop, test, and deploy a digital product in this case, right? It's also known as ALM, so Software Development Lifecycle, Application Lifecycle Management. One of the two things, they both pretty much mean the same thing. If you want to push that a bit further, you also look at like the whole product thinking, and that's what I do. It's not just about building something and getting it out and then forgetting it's there. In use, that product in use is also very, very important. And that's why we've got those 3 components to it. You've got the quality of the product, you've got the quality of the product in use, and what we're trying to get better at here with this methodology is the management of that entire process. So the SDLC, there's lots of different things and different metrics and the bits of information that you can use. One thing I'm just going to say is none of these should and can never be used to blame someone for something going wrong, right? Everything here is only monitored for you to look for changes and fluctuations as you're making changes to the process to see whether you've improved the situation or made the situation worse. So the first thing I want to point out is this is always an ongoing experiment. You look at what you've done, you track it, and you make changes. So as we look through and we'll start to discover. So in the 1 o'clock position at the top, we want to look at all the metrics that have been presented from people using the product. We want to look how long it takes us to do a discovery in that phase. And we want to look at the user discovery, which can be rather subjective. We go round clockwise to design. So again, when we're designing, we make sure that we're looking back at how it was in use. We want to make sure that we keep a track of how long that design time lasted as well. There's always ways of improving each of these sections. So design time, it could be tooling, integration of tooling. It could be changing the way you do things. You could change to using design sprints or etc. So there's different ways of doing that. But all I'm going to talk really about is what we're tracking, how to quantify that, and how to cycle that background. Development. So this actually touches a little bit on something Karam said about hooks and other things like that. Developers can get a lot of these metrics back extremely quickly in this phase without leaving this cycle point inside of here and allowing them to do self-improvement in their own little develop cycle. Things that we really want to look at here is things like develop time. So, you know, how long your ticket was open for until it's actually set to done inside of there. We also want to look at something called code volume, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Test is where we start to look at more at the quality metrics of the actual product. And there are a lot of quality metrics. I'm going to go through them in detail, but there are a hell of a lot and a lot more than you probably think there are inside of there. But we also want to look at the execution time of the tests. But how are we going to quantify that? And again, I'll go over that. And something else, coverage, right? I'm going to touch on coverage. Coverage isn't really that useful. Put that on the table. It's nice to see that you've got coverage because it means that you're actually covering the acceptance criterion of the actual product, right? Anything outside of covering the acceptance criterion of the product, it can be seen as either a waste or a benefit, depending on what type of product that you're doing, right? So NASA going to the moon want to try and cover everything, even test other people's code. But if we're writing a website, we don't want to test other people's code. So our coverage is going to come right down to just going and covering our acceptance criterion. Test deploy, we want to know how long the deployment lasted, what errors that we had in when deploying to the test environment. And that's where we start doing what's called integration testing. Integration testing is where we put all the bits together. It can be either mocked, so some bits aren't real, or a full facsimile of production, which is usually the best case scenario, but it can be very expensive, right? If we look at the more basic version, we just skip that out entirely because integration testing can be very expensive. If we've got enough confidence in our testing from a develop test phase, so locally tested, pipeline tested code, then we don't need to do that integration testing at that phase, right? We can skip that and save some cost. But a lot of the time, especially at the level we're working at, we do have integration testing or an integration testing environment. So I have included that here. Again, we've got deploy to production. Might not be the same as test. So we want to make sure we check the time it takes to deploy to production and any errors that are thrown in there. We want that to make sure that's stable and timely when pushing and overwriting code that end users are using. And then in use, how are they using it? What are they using? And what are the errors that people are finding? Three very, very simple things to look at. You know all these things, right? If you think about it and think about each stage, you know that these are the things that we check. So we go down and we simplify that one step further, right? One, we're looking at the time spent. How long did that stage take? How long did that operation take? You know, what we want from that is, does our change make that go up or make it go down? Errors can be defects or they can be an environmental error, and they also have a severity. So they can be just informational or they could be critical, right? Depending on the severity, changes on how you deal with them, on how you look at them inside of there as well. It can also form what we call a quality gate. So you could say that we could have 20 informational errors per 1,000 lines of code in our application. I'll explain that in a bit. This would be a certain defect density limit that we put in our application as a hard stop in the pipeline, in the development and deployment pipeline, before we push that code out. So there's things that we can do in there to put automated test gates and informational pieces into our pipeline that we can pull that out and utilize that to enable us to go faster. So things that we learn by these metrics, we can actually put some automated gates into that pipeline so that we can prevent those limits being surpassed later. But when they're not surpassed, it just goes straight through, removing some manual process. And the three important areas are quality in product, as I said, quality in management, and quality in use. So the other thing that I touched on just there is quantification. Never use an unquantified metric, right? Something that's set as a percentage has already been quantified by one form or another. There's two general things that you quantify something by. One is by time and one is by volume, right? Time is measured by point X to point Y. It can be a part of the cycle. It can be an execution time. It can be the manual time it takes to do a task. So for example, if you are looking at the metrics for the tests, that would be the test quantity over the execution time would give you an average test time. You measure that, and then as you're running through the cycles and you're adding more tests, you can see that bloat up. When it gets to a point where you go, wow, this isn't actually, the actual average time is going up. There's something wrong here. You can have a look at that and start bringing that down and doing an investigation. So, you know, spotting tech debt before it becomes unmanageable. So there are very, very useful things in here that you can utilize. It's mostly imagination, right? What can you imagine? Right, what's my scenario here? What do I need to monitor? Volume, right? So this is where I'm going to explain what we call LLOC, logical lines of code. So a single line of code can be made up of multiple statements, a bit like a math equation. If we take that math equation and we break it down as you did in math class back in whether you did O levels or GCSEs or however old you are, yes, I know what O levels are, so I'm showing my age. Then each one of those statements inside of that would be a different logical statement, and that's what we're talking about with LLOC. We break down an LLOC value breaks down the code into the amount of logical statements inside of there. So no matter how clever the developer is trying to put code in on as few lines as possible or as many lines as possible, you will pretty much always get the same LLOC value out of a code base, right? Now what it means is you have a volume value that you can then use to quantify other values such as defects inside of here. So by this, if we go take all the critical defects, say we have 5 critical defects and we have 1,000 lines of code, right? We can work out the density of those defects inside of that. We usually do it by per 1,000 lines of code, which is why I use that. So if you've got 5 critical defects in 1,000 lines of code, that's more severe than if you've got 5 critical defects in 10,000 lines of code. So it allows you to get that bigger holistic view of your issues inside of your code base as you develop in a product. Okay. Now it's very important to remember that a metric is just a value if it is not quantified, right? If you say you've got 10 defects, that doesn't really mean anything on its own. You've got 10 defects. How big is your project? How big is your code base? If you've got several hundred lines of code and you've got 10 defects, you've got a serious problem. If you've got 10 defects and you've got 1 million lines of code, it's not that big a problem, right? So from a monetary value, you've got something to work with there.
Hugh, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes.
We have a question from Damala. Is all this happening within a CI/CD process?
It can be done in the CI/CD process, and it can be done to automate quality gates in the CI/CD process, so you can kick out builds inside of there. So for example, if you find a certain amount of defects in your testing inside of there, say you've got different, so you run something called a linter, which looks for specific known issues inside of there. Sometimes some people say, well, we don't want any errors in our linter, but if you want to give a little bit of leeway, you can say, well, I'm going to allow 2 or 3 errors per 1,000 lines of code, or 10 errors per 1,000 lines of code, and that's my hard limit. So a real world example for me is I use Cypress Lighthouse, which is a thing that checks your performance, accessibility, etc. inside of your code and gives you a quantified percentage value back. And I have my code set to 90 for performance, 100% for accessibility inside of there. And those are hard quality gates. If my code doesn't pass those quality gates, it gets kicked out, right? And you can do that with pretty much any metric inside of there if you want to set those limits. Otherwise, what you do is you pull these values back and you put them onto a dashboard from your CI/CD pipeline, from your development pipeline, from your ticketing system, and you can then monitor those metrics over time for any changes that you want to make. Does that answer your question?
Camol has just raised his hand, so do you have another question?
Yeah, just a bit of clarification. So I mean, I think what you just said, you explained what I was about to ask. So yeah, I'm imagining, I'm thinking before, like while you're writing code, are you detecting these defects before you're actually committing the code to GitHub, or is it after? Is it like during the build process, during a testing, like when everyone's code is being tested?
That's your choice.
Together. So is this while you're these defects, are they being detected before, like while you're developing yourself, or what? Well,
that's totally your choice, right? So let me explain why that's the case. So if you're using a very big, very expensive security scanner, for example, right, that you're paying a large license for, you can't afford to put that on every developer's machine. So that goes inside of the pipeline. So that could be a security defect that is found during the pipeline, right? If you run a local linter, you can run that locally. But here's the kicker. Sometimes it's faster to run that linter on your CI/CD pipeline than it is locally. If your developer is doing a lot of commits, what they don't want to happen is watch their linter work for about 20 or 30 seconds every time they do a commit. They're going to get frustrated. It's going to feel slow and unwieldy. So you've got to decide from a people perspective where that also wants to run. You know, it's going to run before it gets deployed. It doesn't matter. And you will run it again in the pipeline anyway. So how much do you want to peeve off your developers is the question there, right? You know, this is why sometimes you will run your unit tests on a Git hook. So like when the developer writes the code, they go to push it up and it runs the unit tests to make sure that they're all executing. And that's usually optimized on the developer's machine and very, very much instantaneous. But integration tests tend to run for quite some time and take a lot longer. So they tend to run in the pipeline. So what you're doing is freeing up your developer by just running the integration testing pipeline, unit tests locally for the developer, and allows the developer just to keep on going and churn out code. They will get that feedback back in 20 minutes from the pipeline, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, depends how well you optimize it, an hour I've seen, right? I've seen integration tests running for 45 minutes. You don't want to be running that locally. So it just frees the developer up so that they continue working. And that allows you to reduce that development time down inside of there. Does that make sense? Yeah, so this is why monitoring the metrics is very useful, because you can decide, right, I'm going to tell the developers I want them to all run their integration tests. Then you can look at your development time cycle in your ticketing system. So, you know, the ticket, like the ticket's actual life cycle itself. And then you push it into the, then you do another experiment and you push it into the pipeline, and then you look at the pipeline time and the development time. And then if you look at the differences of those, you can tell in that total amount of time whether you've improved the situation or not. Sometimes making the situation worse is also better if you are making your developers' lives or easier, right? If you aren't frustrating them, right? It's a people thing as well.
I'm just like, here, cheers, brilliant. I'm just trying to visualize what you're saying and compare it with what I know. Jenkins, is this? Do you know what I mean by Jenkins?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Is like a Jenkins? Is the Jenkins tool? Is Jenkins a tool that you'd use to do all these things that you're talking about?
Yes,
platform
for this. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Is it a popular one?
So it depends on the code that you're running. Your developers will know this. We'll go into some of the categories and you'll be able to have a look at that in more detail. You don't run everything. You don't always want everything. You pick and choose. It's like a pick and mix sweet shop, right? When you see the amount of categories that you've got to decide what's important for you. You know, and the idea here is trimming the fat and continuous improvement, right? So some of the other ones that aren't just defects inside of here is complexity. So that's looking at how difficult it will be to understand, to provide understandability inside of the code and do improvements later, which leads into maintainability. It's another type of metric that can be used with linters and things like that, and you can pull those metrics out. Your defect density and also uninspected defects. How long do they live for? Because a defect makes a defect, right? And these are all things that are quantified based upon code volume, right? It's really important for teams to be able to work faster if they can see the results of the work in a fast and timely manner. So altering these things for different teams and different code bases is very important. There isn't a rule that is for everyone. Every project is different, right? Two similar projects will be very similar and they probably will work. But if you go and work on one set of one project, then go and work on another, don't expect what you've done there to work over here, because you'll have different team sizes, you'll have a different pipeline, you'll have different business rules and things to deal with as well. So there's a lot to take into account, and most of this is experimentation, right? That's why there are no fast and hard rules. So software quality, as I said, there's three main things in software quality. There's the quality in the product, quality in management, and quality in use. And this is what QA is, right? QA just isn't testing the product. QA is the whole life cycle of the product inside of there. So quality in product is actual testing of the product, and that's what most people think QA is. But you've also got quality management, which is the continuous improvement of the process of building the product, which is the thing that we want to get better at, and that's understanding the other two. And then quality in use, how the users view that system inside of there. And combined, yes, this is quality assurance. This is the whole picture. So quality in use, there's five main areas in quality in use: satisfaction, freedom from risk, context coverage, effectiveness, and efficiency. Right. So satisfaction is then broken down into several more areas, allowing it to be easily understood. Useful? Is it useful? Do you trust the product? You know, what's the end user pleasure? What's the comfort in using the product? We often use tools to feed this back, to get like heat maps from the end users. We get trust scores from users. We get written feedback from stores and Trustpilot and things like that from the end users as well. Phone calls, complaints, other things inside of there. Congratulations, thank yous. These all count as that feedback for the satisfaction. Freedom from risk. You know, if you're going to be producing a new mobile app and just chucking it into the app store, if you make an absolute dog's ear of it, no one's ever going to touch your apps ever again. It's a very, very cutthroat area. So there is a high risk of, there's a high economic risk in there for your company for doing something badly. For some things, it could be a health and safety risk. So you're integrating with a factory, for example. Environmental risk, the same. Context coverage, you know, do you do everything that the customers want? Are you missing anything out in there? Are you flexible enough to give different people the different view inside of how they use their product? People want to use it in different ways. Some want to use a mobile app, some want to use a web page. How effective is it is and how efficient it is. You know, the work that you produce will, though, and this is the important thing for the other two areas, reflect on the quality of the environment that it's done in. So a good environment where you trust your developers and they get this feedback and are able to understand how people are feeling about those products will reflect directly on the quality of the product that you're doing. So it's very important that management aren't the only people who see this, but your developers are. So that's the first point, quality management, right? This is the one that a lot of companies try and do, and they do it wrong because they hold it too tightly, right? Or they just don't do it. So quality management is this process of improvement, but it's also the process of governance of the process itself, right? So it's the production control, the design control, the surveillance of the product while it's in use or while it's in test. So you can see how it's acting. Are your resources up to date? Things like workshops, documentation. Do you own your own infrastructure? Is it well maintained? Do you keep things up to date? Change management. This one is in most companies, they have a change management process, but then ignore the rest, right? Are you pushing out a change that's going to affect the end users badly? Creative and preventative action. So in here, you need some, like a managed process, so you need some stuff from analytics inside of there. That's very useful. And management responsibility as well. This also needs to be a managed process. You need to be able to have that oversight and that discussion, but have it with the teams, have it with the developers, have it with the designers, so that you have that inside of there. And then for the final part, the thing that we are all very, very much used to, and is the quality in product. Now, some of these areas people won't actually have thought about, but there are a lot of things inside of here that you could use. And I've got some examples of different ways you could actually either mitigate or check for these items. So functional suitability, you can use Cypress inside of there. Some things that can impact that are things like no user feedback. Your performance efficiency, so impacts that I've seen for in here are not having anything from service for NFRs. You could use things like I said, like Lighthouse to check performance efficiency. Compatibility, how well does it work with other systems? Usability, things like style guides, UX design processes, accessibility requirements, those sorts of things inside of there. Reliability is often got no coverage at all, right? People don't know how reliable their software is. They know, well, we've had some issues, but that's it. Right? They don't see how often it goes down. Security is, it can be anything from the poor handling of defects that you've got inside of there. A non-security defect can also affect security. And that's very important to understand. You've got tools like Sonar Cloud, DAS scanners inside of there. Maintainability as well, as I said before, linters and things like that, and portability as well. So tools like K8s or AWS and Azure allow you to be portable in your design and the way you produce that code as well. Right. So we've got these 3 different areas: quality and use. You've got those 5 areas in quality and use. You've got the 7 areas in quality and management, and you've got the 8 areas in quality and product for you to think about, right? And there are a lot of different metrics that you can think about in there. But what do we put over the top of that for the improvement? I mean, ISO make this easy. The ISO 9000 gives us a template on how to look at this, right? So we have our requirements, they go into the product. We build a product and it goes out to the customer, and we're measuring the satisfaction and the metrics that we've got from our SDLC, right? From all the way back up. If we go up here, here, like we measure these metrics and we look at them over time, right? Once we've got that in place and we're going to cycle through to our next improvement or do some tools, we look at how that went. And we went, this bit was a lot slower than we were expecting it to be. Have a look at our metrics. What went wrong? Do we think went wrong? Okay. Say our tests are running very slowly. So we'll put some time in to improve our tests and put some of our resource and move it from product features into improving our tests. And then we cycle that through and see if we've improved the situation. So you might not get a cost benefit on the next time you cycle through, but a few cycles later, you'll see that cost benefit. And that's the idea of this. Everything should be a small change that is measurable by the metrics inside of the system. And because I've run out of time, that'll be me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hugh. Amazing. Has anybody got any questions? We've got lots of clapping going on all over the place. I've now learned what that clapping symbol is.
Thank you,
You
everyone.
know that after 3 years of lockdown Zoom or whatever long it is. No, brilliant. Thank you. Let me go back to my screen for 1 second. So, move that out of the way. Okay. I personally have learned a little bit of something about cloud there, a little bit of something about coding, a bit of producty stuff. Quite a nice, diverse meetup. I'm hoping. Hope everyone else is taking something away from that. Our next meetup is on November the 3rd, same time, same channel. We've got the wonderful James Whiteley, who has been with And as long as I have. He's an amazing Scrum Master, and he's a product analyst like myself. He will be talking about what's the point of agile metrics at all. And we've got Daryl, who's been around even longer. He's one of our senior agile trainers, and he's going to be looking at how relevant agile principles are in our new remote working practices. So that's amazing. And then after that, our December meetup will address some of the feedback that we've had, excuse me, where we will be helping Santa to create a wish list. We will be putting Scrum into action to help Santa as little elves and do tasks. And for those that want to know what it's like actually working in a Scrum team, going through the Scrum events, ceremonies, we will be doing all of that. So that will be hopefully a bit of fun over in December. I think that's probably the 1st of December. So that's that. All that remains is for me to click this. If you could scan that, that will take you to our ideas board where you can have a look at the feedback that's already been submitted and leave some of your own if you wish. And absolute massive thank you to Hugh and Karam, who've given their time free of charge tonight to come and share their knowledge with us, which I know